So my theme is tomorrow, it's always a day away. We sometimes see technologies that seem to be about to take over the industry, and then it takes a little bit longer than we expected to take over the industry. But I'm really honored to be able to kick off the TTC 2018. You have a great program here, and thanks to everyone who put it together, especially the publicity people, because I see your logo all over town on every bus and subway. It's just amazing. So this is my day job. I work at the Metropolitan Opera. I'm the engineer in charge of the Metropolitan Opera Live in HD, which is, for the last season, going to 73 countries, more than 2,200 cinemas on all 7 continents, including Antarctica. In Canada here, on the left is a logo that I picked up from a news story about how the Met helped save Cineplex from bankruptcy. Landmark's logo is there because at the SMPTE-affiliated HPA Tech Retreat in 2017, the president and CEO of Landmark Cinemas said that the 2 greatest things that happened to cinema recently are reclining chairs and the Metropolitan Opera. Because they get to charge a lot for the ticket prices, and they get half of that, and they're very happy with it, and it fills up their theaters. So when did this idea, by the way, here again, we're even at Antarctica, the upper left there. The idea for this appeared in print on March 30th, 1877. This is the New York Sun, and here's an article about something that at the time was called the electroscope. And it says, both telephone and electroscope applied on a large scale would render it possible to represent at one time on 100 stages in various parts of the world the opera or play sung or acted in any given theater. So where did that idea come from in 1877? Well, in 1876, there was a lecture about the photosensitive properties of selenium, the action of light on selenium by Carl William Siemens. And the lecture takes up about 11 pages in the Journal of the Royal Institution. And right at the end, the last 2 paragraphs, one of them says, before concluding, I want to introduce to your notice a little apparatus. And so he shows this apparatus, which has a selenium plate on the left and a lens on the right and some shutters to close it. And he says that, there's some analogy between this and the human eye. And then he says, here we have then an artificial eye which is sensible to light. No one had ever said anything like that before. And the world went crazy. We have television. The word wasn't coined until 1900, but here's Scientific American, and they say, we wish that we could say that this gives vision to the blind, but it does not yet, but at least there's a germ of promise in that direction. I sometimes think every publication in the world covered this. It was in English, French, German, Italian, Polish, Portuguese, Spanish, the Journal of Education for the province of Quebec, the Wallaroo Times in South Australia, the Bruce Herald, they all covered this artificial eye. And so beginning the following year in 1877, 8 or 9 people started doing research into television. In Portugal, in France, in what was then Poland, and in the United States, in England, all these people were trying to make television systems. And sure enough, within just a little over a year, here's a report from a doctor of ophthalmology in Dublin, and he says, I have succeeded in transmitting built-up images of very simple luminous objects. So there is the first television picture published in 1879. The work, he says he'd been doing it for several months, so maybe it was in 1878 that he did it. So this is really terrific. And furthermore, he comes up with the first television frame rate, says we need 10 a second, and he comes up with the scanning system. He says he's going to use a copying telegraph scanning system. Well, what's this copying telegraph? Well, this guy, Alexander Bain, in 1842, came up with the idea of image scanning for transmission and patented it in 1843. He patented horizontal scanning lines, line sync, frame sync, pixels. It's all in there in his 1843 patent. And for the 25th anniversary of the Institute of Image Electronics Engineers in Japan in 1997, someone actually built his apparatus according to the patent, and here it is transmitting an image. It's a nice, clear image. He's using only the specifications in the patent to do that. So, seems like a terrific system. Unfortunately, it was a little slow. And selenium, unfortunately, had a bunch of lag. So he was unsuccessful in doing scanning, so he came up with a matrix of selenium cells going to a matrix of platinum wires, and that's how he achieved his first image. But he does not despair of accomplishing the object because he's looking for a more suitable substance than selenium. Unfortunately, he died. So he was not able to achieve television. So it took a while longer till John Logie Baird before we could have televised images of recognizable human faces. So here's the Metropolitan Opera again, and this is 1952. And we are transmitting live to 31 cinemas in 27 cities in the United States. Again, quite successful. More than 60,000 seats were sold at the equivalent of a $75 top today. It was low definition, it was black and white, it was worse than AM radio quality sound. But even in a cinema where the transmission got interrupted and switched to something else for a brief period, the reports were all extremely positive. Everyone loved it. So why did it take from then until roughly 2006 for us to continue? By the way, why did the people love it so much? Well, when you go to a cinema, there's a group mentality. If no one else is complaining about the quality, why should I complain? And uniformly, I've gone to various Met cinemas for encore presentations, people applaud. Now, the singers can't hear them, but it's a group activity. There's also a cognitive dissonance that's going on. You spent money, you spent time and effort to get to the cinema to see this stuff. Maybe you had to hire a babysitter. So if it was bad, then you were stupid. But you don't want to be stupid. Therefore, it must have been good. But it was a different era. The reason that it was not an ongoing thing in 1950s was cinema was tremendously successful in the 1950s. And the cinemas didn't want to hurt their audiences by bringing in an opera when they could be showing movies. Maybe they'd make a little bit more money for the opera, but there's an opportunity cost. Somebody would go to a different cinema. So here's a report from SMPTE Winter Television Conference in 1981. It was one of the most spectacular events to be at. This was in San Francisco. And two of the things that were going on, the first operational digital video demonstrations, including recording. Some of you may recognize Ken Davies on the right there of CBC. He was chairman of the Working Group on Digital Video Standards. And on the left is Francis Ford Coppola looking at one of the first demonstrations of widescreen HD TV in the United States. So really terrific, 1981. But it took quite a while for both digital video and HD TV to come out. Now today, if you weren't here, you could be at another SMPTE event, also run by the San Francisco section of SMPTE. They call it ET at 2008, whatever that means. ET stands for Entertainment Technology, I guess entertainment technology at this point in time. But their subtitle is Where Technology Drives Storytelling. To which I say, what? We don't want technology to drive storytelling. We want what you guys say. Technologies for storytelling. Technologies to help storytelling. The only way we do technology driving storytelling. Well, I'll show you that in a moment when I get to artificial intelligence. So at the conference today, we're going to be discussing virtual reality, artificial intelligence, high dynamic range, IP, IMF, and archiving. So let's start with virtual reality. This was at NAB in April. Norm Hurst, who took the picture, calls it practicing safe VR. Everyone had to put on a little face shield before they could use this VR system because they were pressing their faces up against this thing that had two 8K displays. So resolution was spectacular. It weighed quite a lot, and that's why it was suspended from an armature. The latency was not so great. As you turned it, it would go jerk, jerk, jerk. But still, nice resolution. So when did this concept of having a head-mounted display that was assisted by some armature come out? This was a picture that appeared in a technical journal. It appeared in a technical journal 50 years ago. A head-mounted three-dimensional display. This is virtual reality in 1968 with everything that we have today, except they're using CRTs for the displays. But that wasn't the earliest. Here's a head tracking camera from a patent that was applied for in 1931. So what are some of the issues with VR? Well, there's spatial resolution. The 8K certainly takes care of that. There's latency, which is a problem if you have the 8K. It's less of a problem if you have lower resolution. Comfort. That's why they had that thing holding up the thing, but there's also visual comfort. How do you deal with stereoscopy when things are at different distances? And then there's the use. Now, I think this is a perfect use that's being shown here in Road to VR training. Any form of training, VR is really wonderful for. But if you're doing storytelling, it's a little different. Here's the Nokia Ozo. This was a VR camera that was absolute hit of the 2016 NAB show, and it was dropped by Nokia in 2017. This is at this year's NAB show. It's called the Volumetric Video Studio, and it's taking the idea of VR and kind of turning it inside out, at least from the shooting. The cameras now are in the walls of this studio, and the actors move around in them. So here is an actor in a little piece that was done for the 100th anniversary of the German film studio UFA. And it's amazing. You put on the VR device and you can walk around the actors and you can see what's going on from their point of view. It's not just moving your head. It's going around the scene. But a problem with VR for storytelling is how do you direct a VR movie? If I'm looking over here, how do I know what action is happening here? And some people say, well, you could have an audio cue or something like that. But if I'm walking around completely, like in this volumetric video, then maybe even the audio cue is coming from the wrong place. So directing a volumetric movie is really, really awkward. Nevertheless, VR seems to be saving movie theaters like the Metropolitan Opera and so on, except it's not in the auditoriums. They're doing it in the lobbies to get people into the movie theaters because they can provide VR experiences that you can't necessarily have at home. You could have a heater to blow hot air at you. You could have various desks or things for you to feel that are in the right places. You can have laser guns or something like that. And then there's this interesting thing that Paramount has come up with. This is VR in the home, but what are you doing? You're attending a movie in a virtual cinema. So you see that there are people around you, and you can have conversations with them before the movie starts, I hope, or after it's over. Want to really get statistics on VR? Here's Pornhub, and they can tell you what countries are doing the most VR and so on. So remember 3D TV? Remember when at NAB that was what we had to do? 3D TV was absolutely mandatory for our industry. Well, here's a headline, 3D TV thrives around the United States, and it's talking about how the ITU working group is ready to come up with an agreement on standards for 3D television. This story appeared on April 22nd, 1980. That wasn't the first. Here was Business Week in 1953, 3D invades TV. And that wasn't the first. Remember I said John Logie Baird first achieved actual image of a recognizable human face? Well, in 1928, he came up with 3D TV. You can see the little 3D hood about the little to the right of the center of the picture. How about in movie theaters? Well, there was glasses-free 3D in a movie theater. I'll show you how they achieved that in a moment. In Moscow in 1941. Active shutter viewing in 1922. 3D movie projection in New York at the Astor Theater in 1915. And the earliest photographic motion picture patent in the world, 1852, happened to be for 3D movies. Jules Dubosc. So this is at the Moscow Stereo Kino, and this is how they did glasses-free viewing. There was a parallax barrier, and you had to sit very stationary and rigid in your seat. But if you were in the appropriate place, then you saw 3D, and the eye saw the correct images. However, 3D, even in movie theaters today, is not doing very well. It's down to a 12% share of revenue from 21% in 2010, and the actual numbers of dollars are down too, and the number of films in 3D are down. The only thing that's up is more and more cinemas are now capable of showing 3D. I'll get to why that might be an issue later. Now, why is there a problem with 3D? Why are so many people not buying tickets for 3D? Well, you're telling a director to direct a movie that has to work as well in stereoscopic 3D as it does in 2D, because there aren't enough people watching just 3D to support the movie. Does that sound like a difficult situation? Yeah, what's the big deal? Well, it's kind of like telling a director, I want you to direct a movie that works as well as a silent as with sound. It's not so easy to do. Artificial intelligence, another venerable technology. The term was coined in 1955 by John McCarthy of Dartmouth. And artificial intelligence, saying my product has artificial intelligence, it's kind of like saying my product uses connections. There's many, many definitions for artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence could do many things, but these days, the kind of stuff we're talking about is voice recognition, image recognition, voice reconstruction, image reconstruction, and technical adjustments. And so, good news, faster workflows and easier versioning. Bad news, potentially loss of some jobs, like assistant editors. Easier fixes is good. Bad news, fake news. What do I mean by fake news? This, by the way, is why I was saying before that there is maybe one instance where technology drives storytelling. MIT has actually come up with a psychopathic AI system, just to see what it would be like. It's called Norman. You can go to that edu and look it up, see the world as Norman sees it. But with that exception, here's some good news on AI. IBM's Watson doing a fantastic job on closed captioning. This was Valosa, a Finnish company at NAB in 2017. And the AI is identifying not only that there are people there, but who the people are. But then there was this story in the New York Times, facial recognition is accurate if you're a white guy. So let me show you somebody who's not a white guy. This is former President Obama. And if you go to this site, which I really, really recommend you go to, it's called futureoffakenews.com, you can see this little clip of former President Obama saying something that he never said. But you see him, you hear him, it's absolutely his voice, and so on. The voice part is taken care of by something like Adobe Voco. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but basically if you give Adobe Voco about 40 minutes of anybody talking, you can have that person say anything in terms of the audio. And then video, there are various other systems where you have an actor who is being shot with a camera. The camera sees the motions of the mouth and the eyes and the eyebrows and so on, and makes the other person's mouth and eyes and eyebrows do the same thing. So current President Trump once said the Access Hollywood tape was real, and now he's not so sure about it. When this stuff comes out and becomes widely available, he's not going to be sure of anything. And I think maybe we have a responsibility of putting some precautions into this, making it easy for engineers to be able to tell very quickly whether something is real or has been modified. But Adobe is putting AI into its Creative Cloud. Here's some of the stuff that they can do. Match color, they can do audio ducking, motion graphics, all using AI. And like good drug pushers, they hook you when you're young by giving you stuff for free. But cinematographers at the NAB show are not so crazy about how images might be manipulated in post. They want to do the manipulation when they're shooting, and maybe they have a hand in post, but they don't want your TV set to change things. So this brings up HDR, and this is something that was at NAB in 2016, and for those of you who have seen my NAB 2016 presentations, I made fun of it, because on the left is HDR, in the middle is SDR, and on the right is something they're calling SDR upconversion, and it doesn't look anything like either the HDR or the SDR. So, haha, no good. But that was 2016. 2 years have passed. So at the HPA Tech Retreat this year, Technicolor showed a baseball game that was upconverted to HDR from SDR. And I looked, and I looked, and I looked, and I looked, and I spent half an hour over the course of days, and I could not find anything wrong. So maybe HDR upconversion can work now, in which case that begs the question, is HDR production and post necessary? If we can do that in the TV set, and boy, HDR certainly pops, your eyes are drawn immediately to the HDR version, do we need to worry about production and post? Here is going in the opposite direction. This is from HDR to SDR. It's a fairly lit room here, but still it's working reasonably well. This is ISO-Video's version, and this was actually shot with 2 cameras and a beam splitter to provide enough dynamic range. When I was talking to Keith Slavin at ISO-Video about this, and he started telling me that he's preserving local contrast, I suddenly realized that this was something I had worked on in 1970s with Tom Stockham. This was a paper that was published in the IEEE Proceedings in 1968, and it's a high dynamic range image, and Stockham taught me what was necessary to preserve the local contrast. That's the photographic technique of unsharp masking, and we just did that electronically, and we actually achieved it in 1975. Unfortunately, it worked kind of like this. You could see everything, but it was not entertainment quality at the time. So back to NAB of last year. This was something called Sony Canvas, spectacular display capable of HDR. At NAB 2018, the major change that I could find is that they changed the name from Canvas to Crystal LED, but still a spectacular display. 32 feet wide and 8K and so on. But if you have an image something like this, where it's a little blurry on the sides and you're sitting really close to it to take advantage of the 8K, not so great if you're sitting in front of a blurry section. Now here are some viewing tests. I think I probably showed this to you before. These were conducted by the EBU, except for the ones on the right, which were conducted by the École Polytechnique in Lausanne, Fédérale in Lausanne. So the one on the left is increasing resolution, going from HD to 4K. And there's definitely a perceptible difference, but it's between a third and a half a grade of improvement. It's not a lot. In the middle is increasing frame rate, and there's a grade about every doubling of frame rate. So 2 times the data rate and you're getting a grade of improvement. And then on the right is some HDR results, and between 0 and, let's say, 0.2 of an increase in the data rate, you're getting a grade of improvement. So HDR is really quite wonderful. So here's that Sony Crystal LED this year, and I just increased the brightness on this image. I didn't even take another image. You can see there's an awful lot of dynamic range in that image, and it's really terrific. So people are starting to talk about having direct view cinema, the greatest change in cinema since Charles Francis Jenkins projected movies in 1894. And there was even a Cinema Emissive Display Association that's gotten creative. So this is a direct view cinema association. And the cinematographers and others are saying, LED cinema screens could change filmmaking and movie-going. And I say, you betcha. If you're interested in HDR and you have not yet read this paper in the SMPTE journal, get hold of it. Sean McCarthy's paper, absolutely brilliant. It was the May-June issue of 2016. How independent are HDR, wide color gamut, and HFR in human perception? And here's just 2 of the charts from his paper, and I've added the little green and red bars. So the green bar is at 60 frames per second, or 60 images per second, and the red bar is at 24 images per second. And on the left, you can see that at cinema brightnesses, today's cinema brightnesses, the SMPTE standard of 14 foot Lamberts is actually a maximum brightness. It's not a minimum brightness. You're okay at 24 frames per second. But if you go up to 1,000 nits, then you need to have 60 frames per second, or you're going to see flicker, which means that we're changing movies from 24 to 60, and changing movies from 24 to 60 is maybe not so great in terms of what they look like. On the right, showing field of view. So if you can sit closer to that direct view cinema display like the Sony Crystal LED, then if you've got a 30-degree field of view as you would at a home TV, no problem, 60 frames per second is fine. But if your field of view increases to, say, 100 degrees, then maybe even 60 images per second is not enough. Now this is a close-up view of the Sony Crystal LED, and it looks like the pixels are getting bigger as they're getting brighter. They're not. The smallest dot that you can see is the size of the LED. And there's lots of space there, but there's currently a coating over it. And the coating has a couple of problems. One is reflections. One of the great things you would think for a direct view cinema screen is, hey, no more reflections. The screen doesn't have to reflect. That's what screens are made to do, but this doesn't. Except it does, because it's got this plastic coating over it. And the reflections are even worse than on a cinema screen at the moment. The other is currently no perforations, so the sound cannot come from behind the screen, but there's plenty of room there to have the perforations. So this is stuff that can be worked out. That's an engineering issue. Moving over to IP, again, NAB 2017, the draft SMPTE standards, and NAB 2018, the SMPTE standards have, for the most part, become approved and published. So we're well along, and this year at NAB, more than 50 companies showing interoperability, so everything is wonderful with IP, and you'll have a whole day tomorrow as well as a little bit of today to get more information about IP. But here's something that appeared on LinkedIn from David Ross, And I've shown what I use to search for it, so it should be easy for you to search for it too. Just David Ross SDI, and he says, is IP SMPTE 2110 really appropriate for every single project? And he says, please bear with me, and I think it's really worth reading. He's not anti-IP by any means, and his company makes lots of wonderful IP stuff, but there are cases where IP is not necessarily what you need to use. And know that IP is something very different. It is not like going from analog to SDI. It's going to a completely different architecture. So there is no patch around in IP. In SDI and analog, if something breaks, you patch around it. In IP, you can move data around, but you don't do that with patching. You do that by getting to some controller and finding another thing. And I ask at lots of IP conventions, what is the failure mode? What do you do when things break? And I asked this at a recent event where NEP was talking about their wonderful IP facilities in Australia. And they said, oh, the failure mode is we have an SDI truck there. You're going to hear about IMF. I just want to mention that when it comes to versions, you think of, okay, there's different languages of dubbing, there's different languages of subtitles. Well, Pixar goes way beyond that. So here are two images from the same movie and basically the same scene in the same movie. This is Inside Out, where the little girl is growing up, and on the left she hates broccoli. But in Japan, apparently, children love broccoli. So that didn't make any sense, so they changed it to green peppers, which children do not like. They change things on the wall. They change how things are done depending on what the culture is. So they do huge number of versions, and IMF is very important for them. So predictions, here are some that David Sarnoff, the famous head of RCA, came up with. Broadcasting, that TV would be successful, color TV, video recording, and so on. And everybody says, wow, he was amazing at predictions. Here are a couple of predictions that he made that have not yet come true anyway. Nuclear flashlights, and that broadcasting will never be commercial. And so here is his secret to predictions. Just predict everything, and when the appropriate time has arrived, point to the successes and forget the failures. So I predict IP is going to take over the industry. I predict IP is going to be awful. One of those is going to come true. So here are some predictions I made in 1978 at a conference. I predicted solid-state cameras, not much of a prediction in 1978. There were already lots of prototypes. I predicted direct brain stimulation, that we would directly stimulate the visual and oral cortices. And why did I do that? Because there were already some experiments. So we tend to predict the past. That has not yet come to fruition. I did predict touchscreen image manipulation. Maybe that was my prediction. I'm not sure. I can't remember of anyone doing anything before that. I predicted thought-controlled pan, tilt, and zoom because there had been experiments done at Battelle National Laboratory that showed a greater than 50% likelihood that if you thought stop, the pan, tilt, and zoom system would stop. Stop was the greatest command. The others not so successful. I predicted video flashlights because in 1975 I had an exhibition and somebody brought a video flashlight. I predicted recording on crystals because people were talking about holographic recording. That was based on laboratory research. Well, here is a story that appeared in the New York Times in 2015 about storing all of the information in the world on DNA, in which case all of the information in the world would fit into the amount of fluid in a case of wine, one case of wine. And not only does it fit in there, but it's self-replicating. So for those of you who think the greatest invention in archiving has been the constantly migrating archive, so you don't have to worry about the life of the storage medium, DNA is great for that. DNA constantly replicates. Of course, I look different from the other people in this room because DNA does change every now and then. So need some way of figuring out when there was a change and coming back. So again, we predict based on the past. This is a prediction that appeared in a French science fiction novel that was published in 1846, Le Monde qu'est-il sera, or the World as It Shall Be. And the author predicted the 24-hour news cycle. But what was the medium for the 24-hour news cycle? A continuous roll of newspaper. Because continuous newsprint had just been invented 2 years before. So that was the thing that he predicted based on the past. If you were rich, then you had lots of rollers in your apartment, and you could take your time reading as it went through the different rollers. If you were poor, then you pulled up one of these chairs on the street, and you got to watch as the newspaper went by. So why do we often get things wrong? Well, it's because we predict the past. We don't know how to predict the future. Edwin Land famously said at one point, you cannot do market research on a product that does not exist. We also predict what we think we can sell. So stereoscopic 3D TV was something we thought we could sell, and everybody would have to buy a new TV set. The pet rock was something that somebody got rich selling in 1975. It was a rock in a little cardboard container with breathing holes and a little straw and a booklet telling you how to care for your pet rock. So somebody said, but now we're in the digital age, I will sell the USB pet rock. It was not as successful. But what actions happen don't necessarily have anything to do with what we've been predicting. So nobody predicted binge viewing. But Netflix said, okay, we'll just make everything available at once, and binge viewing happened, and it has really changed the industry. And now one of the things that's happening, maybe near and dear to director Sergei Eisenstein's heart, the vertical aspect ratio. Because why? Because we all have cell phones, and we hold them like this. So our predictions are a little weird. Here's something called a silicon retina. Now, that very first achieved television image that I was telling you about from 1878, 1879 was achieved by having a matrix and no frame rate. So here's a little spinner with a black dot on it, and it just goes to gray when the guy spins it because the frame rate isn't high enough. But if we go to a silicon retina, which reacts the same way that our eye's retina reacts, it deals only with change. Now we're seeing this thing spinning, and this is the equivalent of an incredibly high frame rate, but it's actually low data rate because the retina is only reacting to the change. And yet you can see the dot very, very clearly. So maybe we can have television with no frame rate, because frame rate is the one thing that doesn't seem to have any basis in the real world. Our retinas do not have frame rate. Or you could go to a trillion frame per second camera. You are watching a pulse of light passing through a Coca-Cola bottle. That's what a trillion frames per second will get you. And shortly after this trillion frame per second camera came out, there was one in Japan with 4.4 trillion frames per second. But what else can you do with a trillion frame per second camera? Well, you can do things that you couldn't conceive of before, like shooting things that are around the corner, shooting things that you yourself can't see. So you send a pulse, it bounces, it comes back. You can calculate from the pulses. If you go to this website, you'll be able to see this happening. You can see stuff around the corner. Now, theoretically, that introduces motion judder, but AI will help you with filling in the frames so that you don't necessarily have motion judder. So here's Metropolitan Opera. I told you I would start and end with this. This is looking down on the auditorium at one of our productions, and that's where we're putting the cameras, but we have to keep everything out of the way of the audience because there's a paying audience of 4,000 people in there. But what if the ideal shot is a camera front and center right in front of the stage? Well, that's going to disturb everyone in the audience unless here is the football stadium in Barcelona, and these are 6 little machine vision cameras that have been set up. And on the left, you're seeing the 6 images from the 6 machine vision cameras. And on the right, you're seeing things including shots looking down on the field. There is no camera looking down. So just from those 6 cameras, you can calculate the 3-dimensional space and maybe have a virtual camera anywhere you want it. I really, really wanted this, so I was on the advisory board of this organization. It was Project Fine, European Project Fine. But this was NAB in 2012, and now we're in 2018, and I'm still waiting, so I'm afraid tomorrow is always a day away. These slides are available currently there, and the presentation will be posted afterwards. Any questions? We have a few minutes. Okay. I have dazzled you. I have kept you on time. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the conference.